You started choosing yourself more. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. You stopped over-explaining, stopped justifying, stopped waiting for permission to change, and something shifted. The people who used to reach out don't anymore. The friends who swore they'd always support you suddenly feel distant. Conversations that used to flow now feel strained, careful, like they're walking on glass. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't declare yourself better. You just became more complete within yourself. And somehow, that was enough to change everything. Here's what nobody tells you about personal independence. It doesn't just change you. It changes the way people see you. It disrupts something invisible but powerful. The emotional contract you never signed but have been honoring your whole life. The agreement that said your struggles would match theirs, that your growth would happen at the same pace, that you would need them in predictable ways. And when you break that contract, not with words, but with energy, when you stop performing dependency, stop seeking constant validation, stop making your peace contingent on their approval, something in the dynamic cracks. Not always loudly, often silently, a slow withdrawal, a subtle coolness, a shift you feel but can't quite name. And here's the part that unsettles people. This isn't random. This isn't coincidence. This is a predictable social mechanism. A psychological pattern that plays out again and again when someone steps outside the invisible boundaries of group equilibrium. What you're experiencing isn't rejection by accident. It's resistance by design, not conscious conspiracy. Just a quiet, instinctive defense of a social order that depends on everyone staying in their place. Niccolo Machiavelli understood something about human nature that most people spend their lives avoiding. People don't resist change because they hate progress. They resist change because it threatens the structure that gives them predictability, comfort, and control. In any social group, there's an unspoken hierarchy. Not always about status or money, often about emotional roles. Who needs who? Who leans on who? Who validates who? Who plays strong? Who plays weak? And these roles, however subtle, create a kind of ecosystem, a balance. When you were more uncertain, more seeking, more visibly struggling, you played a role in that ecosystem. Maybe you were the one who needed advice, the one who vented, the one whose problems made others feel useful, needed, important. Your dependence wasn't a burden to them, it was a function. It gave them purpose. It reinforced their position. But independence disrupts that. When you become self-contained, when you stop bringing every problem to the group, when you make decisions without needing consensus, when your happiness stops being tied to their presence, you remove yourself from that emotional economy. And to those who derive meaning, value, or power from your need, that removal feels like loss. Not loss of you as a person. Loss of you as a role. Loss of the dynamic that made them feel significant. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people don't love you for your strength. They love you for your struggle, because your struggle gives them relevance. Your questions give them answers. Your doubt gives them certainty. Your chaos gives them the chance to be your calm. And when you no longer need that from them, when you've built your own foundation, when you've learned to self-soothe, self-direct, self-validate, they don't know how to relate to you anymore. The version of you they knew, vulnerable, seeking, malleable, made sense to them. This new version, the one that doesn't perform pain for connection, doesn't overshare to belong, doesn't shrink to make others comfortable, feels foreign, unpredictable, threatening. Most people will never tell you this directly, but independence often gets misread as arrogance. Not because you're doing anything arrogant, but because self-sufficiency, in a culture built on interdependence and social approval, looks like defiance. It looks like you've decided you're above the rules everyone else follows. When you stop asking for permission, people assume you think you don't need guidance. When you stop explaining yourself, they assume you think you're beyond accountability. When you stop engaging in every group conflict, every drama, every emotionally charged conversation, they assume you think you're too good for the mess. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that you've shifted from external validation to internal alignment. You've stopped outsourcing your sense of worth. And in doing so, you've accidentally communicated something that makes people uncomfortable. I don't need you to survive. Not that you don't value them, Not that you don't care, but that your existence, your peace, your sense of self is no longer contingent on their presence or approval. And for people whose identity is wrapped up in being needed, that feels like abandonment. Even if you haven't gone anywhere, even if you're still physically present, emotionally, energetically, you've stepped back. You've created space. And space, to someone used to enmeshment, feels like distance. Distance feels like coldness. Coldness feels like rejection. Here's where it gets darker. People will rarely confront you about this directly, because to confront you would require them to admit what they're actually upset about, that they missed the version of you that needed them more, that they're uncomfortable with your growth because it highlights their stagnation. That your independence forces them to look at their own dependence, their own avoidance, their own fear of standing alone. So instead of saying that, they go quiet, they become passive, they stop initiating. They respond, but barely. They're present, but distant. They punish the behavior they can't articulate. They withdraw affection not because you've harmed them, but because you've disrupted the emotional contract they didn't realize they were relying on. There are two kinds of bonds people form. The first is dependent connection. This is bonding through shared struggle, shared dysfunction, shared complaints. It's intimacy built on mutual need. We suffer together, therefore we belong together. This kind of connection feels intense because it's constantly reinforced by crisis, by drama, by the emotional charge of problems that need solving. It's not fake, it's real, but it's conditional. It requires you to stay in a certain state, to remain accessible in your pain, to keep struggling in ways that are familiar and manageable to the group. The second is secure connection. This is bonding through mutual respect, shared values, and the freedom to evolve without fear of abandonment. It's intimacy built on presence, not need. It doesn't require you to stay small or broken to belong. It celebrates your growth because it's not threatened by it. This kind of connection feels quieter, steadier. It doesn't have the same intensity as dependent connection because it's not fueled by crisis, but it's deeper, more resilient, more honest. And here's the brutal part. Most of the relationships you thought were secure were actually dependent. You just didn't know until you started growing, until you started changing the variables, until you stopped feeding the dynamic that kept everyone comfortable. When you become independent, you run an unintentional test. You reveal which people were connected to your essence and which were connected to your role, which friendships were built on respect and which were built on routine, which bonds can stretch and which will snap. If you've ever felt the quiet ache of being misunderstood for choosing yourself, if you've ever noticed how distance grows the moment you stop performing struggle, comment this: I grow even when it's lonely. To remind yourself that transformation sometimes requires you to walk alone before you find the people who can walk beside the real you. People fear being left behind. That's the core of it. Not because they think you're going somewhere better, but because your independence is a mirror. It reflects back to them the ways they're still stuck, the ways they're still performing, the ways they're still seeking approval, avoiding conflict, dimming themselves to fit in. Your growth isn't an accusation, but it feels like one. Because if you can change, if you can break patterns, if you can stand alone without falling apart, then what's their excuse? Why are they still waiting, still explaining, still bending? Independence also removes leverage. And this is where things get strategic, even if no one's being consciously manipulative. In any relationship, there's a subtle exchange of power. Whoever needs less has more influence. Whoever can walk away more easily sets the terms. When you were more dependent, emotionally, socially, psychologically, you were easier to predict, easier to influence, easier to keep in orbit. But now that you're self-contained, now that your happiness isn't tied to their validation, now that you're comfortable with silence, with solitude, with your own company, the power dynamic shifts. And people feel it. They might not name it, but they sense it. The loss of self-control, the inability to guilt you, sway you, anchor you through emotional appeals. Silence and self-containment create uncertainty, and uncertainty in social dynamics create tension. When people can't read you anymore, when you stop oversharing, stop reacting predictably, stop explaining every choice, they don't know where they stand, and not knowing makes them anxious. So they test you. They pull back to see if you'll chase. They create distance to see if you'll close it. They go quiet to see if you'll break first. It's not always malicious. Often it's unconscious, a social reflex, an attempt to reassign roles, to restore the old balance, to make the relationship feel familiar again. But here's what they don't expect: that you won't chase, that you'll let the silence sit, that you'll respect their distance without begging for closeness, that you've become comfortable enough in your own presence that their absence, while noticed, doesn't destabilize you. And when that happens, when you don't react the way you used to, the dynamic changes permanently. Some people will respect it, will recalibrate, will meet you at the new level. Others won't. They'll interpret your calm as coldness, your boundaries as rejection, your peace as pride, and they'll drift further. Not because you push them away, but because they can't reconcile the old version of you with the one standing in front of them now. From a purely strategic standpoint, scarcity increases perceived value. When you were always available, always responsive, always eager to connect, your presence was abundant, reliable, expected. But abundance, in human psychology, breeds complacency. People take for granted what's always there. It's not cruelty, it's nature. We value most what we fear losing. And when you become less available, not because you're playing games, but because you're genuinely more selective with your energy, you become scarce, and scarcity shifts perception. Suddenly your time matters more. Your attention feels like a privilege, not a given. Your approval carries weight. Predictability decreases social tension. Unpredictability increases attention. When people knew exactly how you'd react, what you'd tolerate, how you'd respond to certain triggers, they could navigate around you with ease. But now that you're more emotionally regulated, more boundaried, more willing to disappoint people to honor yourself, you've become less predictable, not chaotic, not erratic, just less controllable. And that unpredictability, your refusal to follow the old script, creates a kind of gravitational pull. People pay more attention, not always positive attention. Sometimes it's suspicion, sometimes it's resentment, but it's attention nonetheless, because you've broken pattern, and humans are wired to notice disruption. Detachment changes perceived status. When you were emotionally entangled, when your mood was visibly affected by group dynamics, when you sought reassurance, validation, inclusion, you signaled a certain social position, not inferior, but accessible, relatable, safe. But detachment, the ability to remain steady regardless of external approval, to make decisions based on internal alignment rather than group consensus, to be unbothered by exclusion, signals something different: confidence, self-possession, a kind of quiet authority. And in social hierarchies, even informal ones, that shift in energy gets read as a shift in status. Some people will rise to meet it, will respect it, will be drawn to it. Others will resist it, will undermine it, will try to pull you back down to the level where you were more manageable. But here's where we have to pause, because it would be easy to take all of this and turn it into ammunition, to look at the people who've grown distant and label them as weak, envious, or small-minded, to wear your independence like a weapon, to confuse self-sufficiency with superiority. And that's the trap, because the goal of awareness isn't arrogance. It's not to look down on people who are still figuring things out. It's not to become cold or cynical or dismissive. The goal is understanding, protection, discernment. Most people aren't resisting your independence out of malice. They're resisting it out of fear. Fear of inadequacy, fear of abandonment, fear that your evolution means they're being left behind. And while their reaction, the distance, the silence, the subtle hostility, might hurt, it's important to remember that it's not about you. It's about them, about their own unhealed wounds, their own unmet needs, their own unprocessed insecurity. You can hold compassion for that without sacrificing your growth. You can understand their discomfort without shrinking back into the version of yourself that made them comfortable. Independence should make you kinder, not crueler, more patient, not more judgmental, because you know what it's like to be on the other side, to feel threatened by someone else's confidence, to misinterpret someone's boundaries as rejection, to struggle with the gap between who you are and who you want to be. Growth isn't about separating yourself from humanity. It's about becoming more fully yourself while remaining connected to your empathy. The strongest people aren't the ones who've stopped caring. They're the ones who care deeply but refuse to be controlled by that care, who love without losing themselves, who stay open without becoming dependent. So let's trace the arc. You start with belonging, the comfort of fitting in, of being understood, of having your place in the group secured by predictable roles and familiar rhythms. Then you start growing, not because you rejected the group, but because something in you demanded more. More honesty, more alignment, more peace. And that growth creates friction. Small at first, a comment that feels off, a joke that doesn't land the same, a topic you're no longer interested in debating. Then the friction becomes distance. People stop reaching out. Invitations dry up. Conversations become surface level. You notice the shift, but can't quite name it. Then comes misinterpretation. They think you've changed in a bad way, that success went to your head, that you think you're better now. They don't see the work you did in private. The breakdowns, the doubts, the lonely nights where you had to choose yourself even when it hurt. They just see the result, a version of you that no longer needs them the way you used to. And that feels like betrayal. So they pull further back. And now you're in isolation. Not total, not dramatic, but real. A kind of social loneliness that aches because the people you thought would celebrate your growth are the ones most unsettled by it. And this is the breaking point, where some people retreat, shrink back, try to restore the old dynamic, because the isolation feels unbearable. But if you stay steady, if you trust the process, if you refuse to betray yourself to ease their discomfort, something shifts. You move from isolation into self-trust. You realize that your worth isn't contingent on their understanding, that your peace doesn't require their participation, that you can be misunderstood and still be whole. And from that self-trust emerges something quiet but undeniable. Power. Not loud power, not performative power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that's felt, not seen. The kind that comes from being so rooted in who you are that external turbulence can't shake you. So, here's the realization that might sting but needs to be said. Independence doesn't destroy friendships, it reveals them. It shows you which bonds were built on need and which were built on respect, which people loved you for who you are and which loved you for what you provided, which relationships can evolve and which were always meant to be temporary. And that's not a tragedy. It's clarity. Painful clarity, yes, but clarity nonetheless. Not everyone who distances themselves is an enemy. Not everyone who doesn't understand your growth is against you. Some people are just at a different stage. Some are dealing with their own unprocessed pain. Some are so caught in survival mode that your thriving feels like a foreign language. And that's okay. You don't have to vilify them to move forward. You don't have to make them wrong to honor what's right for you. You can hold gratitude for what was while accepting that it's no longer aligned with where you're going. But here's the deeper, darker truth that people avoid. Sometimes the distance isn't about them fearing your success. It's about them fearing what your independence says about their own dependence. Your ability to stand alone forces them to confront the ways they're still clinging, still performing, still seeking external validation as proof of worth. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. So instead of looking inward, they project outward. They make you the problem. They frame your growth as arrogance, your boundaries as coldness, your peace as detachment, because it's easier to blame you for changing than to admit they're afraid to change themselves. You're going to lose people on this path, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because growth is disruptive, because independence challenges the unspoken agreements that hold most relationships together, because becoming yourself, fully, unapologetically, requires you to stop performing the version of you that made others comfortable. And some people won't make the journey with you. They'll stay where it's familiar, where the roles are clear, where no one's challenging them to evolve. And that's their choice. Just like growth is yours. But here's what you need to understand. The loneliness you feel now isn't permanent. It's transitional. You're not being abandoned. You're being recalibrated. The people who are meant to walk with the real you, the whole you, the evolving you, they're coming. Or they're already there, quiet and steady, waiting for you to stop shrinking so they can finally see you fully. The ones who stay won't need you to stay small. They won't be threatened by your peace. They won't mistake your independence for rejection. They'll see it for what it is: strength, self-respect, the courage to choose alignment over approval. If this shifted something in how you see independence and the tension it creates, honor that shift by supporting this message. Like the video so it reaches someone else who's navigating the strange grief of outgrowing old connections. Share it with someone who feels misunderstood for becoming more whole. And if this perspective resonates, if you want to keep exploring the uncomfortable truths about growth, belonging, and power, stay here, subscribe. We go deeper. We don't look away. Growth will cost you comfort. Independence will cost you familiarity. But what you gain, the ability to stand in your truth without permission, to choose yourself without apology, to build a life aligned with who you actually are rather than who people needed you to be, that's worth every moment of misunderstanding. Keep walking. The right ones will match your pace.